Hello, my name is Richard Grannon, and today we are going to be looking at CPTSD symptoms. This video is just for entertainment and education purposes only. If you think you have CPTSD or you know somebody with CPTSD, you should speak to a qualified mental health professional, preferably somebody who specializes in this particular subject. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you what I look for in complex post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, and then I'm going to give you what the mainstream orthodoxy is. I've been looking at complex post-traumatic stress disorder, working with people with CPTSD, writing courses on CPTSD since 2015, so it's about 7 years now. I don't deviate much from the orthodoxy on the subject, but there is a slightly different attitude that I take when I'm looking at the subject. I follow pretty much closely what a psychotherapist from California, San Francisco area called Pete Walker teaches, particularly that which he taught in the book CPTSD From Surviving to Thriving. Largely speaking, the three things that I would be looking for CPTSD. Number one would be high levels of emotional dysregulation. That means the person really struggles to assign the right amount, proportionate, and the right type, appropriate emotions to different situations. So very often disproportionate and often inappropriate emotions come into the situation. So they could become very, very sad, very, very angry, very, very anxious, very, very depressed. Whatever the emotion is, emotional dysregulation plays out in this way, where all of a sudden there are just surges of emotion. These surges of emotion, of course, affect their perception. So their perceptual filters are being corrupted. They're being swayed by the incredibly intense emotions that they're feeling at inappropriate times, at disproportionate levels. So emotional dysregulation would be one of the things that I would be looking for me to be saying, okay, this looks like something that could be complex post-traumatic stress disorder. The second thing that I would be looking for, and this is difficult to detect in clients without educating them on the subject first so that they have a framework for understanding what it is that I'm looking for, would be extremely negative introjects and injunctions from a toxified superego. That is a lot of very jargon style language. What this basically means is that they have a very, very negative and unpleasant inner voice that is constantly berating them, shaming them, telling them things that make them feel angry, guilty, sad, and ashamed, and that they really, really struggle to switch that voice off. I would then also be asking, does this internal voice make you take actions and behave in ways that you later regret? Does this nasty negative internal voice evoke emotions in you that are extremely difficult for you to live with? The third thing that I would be looking for in complex post-traumatic stress disorder would be a very, very chaotic life, a life where they very much struggle to concentrate, they very much struggle to communicate their feelings and to build bonds with other people that are meaningful. They're often misunderstood, their interpersonal relationships are very turbulent. There's not an awful lot of order in their lives, and actually what you see in their place is a lot of coping strategies. Those coping strategies, of course, are frequently, but not always, quite self-destructive. Why? The coping strategies are there to help them cope with the very intense emotional dysregulation and the extremely harsh inner critic that they're carrying. They're often maladaptive is the proper psychological term. They're often self-destructive because they're coping mechanisms. It's not a way of actually dealing with the problem, it's just a way of coping with it. So alcohol, drugs, promiscuous behavior, sometimes even violent behavior, creating a life that's full of drama and full of adrenaline to distract them from the pain that they're feeling internally, from that negative inner voice that's continuously running. These are all things that can happen. Obviously, based on what I've just told you, you can see how easy this would be to mistake for borderline personality disorder. Now let's get into the more of the orthodox way of looking for complex post-traumatic stress disorder in patients in clinical conditions, which I don't operate in. because I'm not a clinician, seek the advice of a qualified mental health professional. This is just a YouTube video. Don't take life-changing decisions from YouTube videos and Instagram posts, please. Let's carry on. So to the more formal and orthodox view of complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Dr. Judith Herman first identified complex post-traumatic stress disorder back in 1992. She's a professor of clinical psychiatry at Harvard. And she identified it as being something that would occur to victims of abuse in a situation where they could not escape. She thought back in the 90s it might end up being included in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual used by the American Psychiatric Association. It never was. It was, however, included in the ICD-11, published in 2018. And I'm going to read out to you little bits and pieces. I presume you're not writing a PhD in this stuff, so you only need to know the bare essentials, but it's good to know where it's come from and how it's thought of within academia as well. So in the ICD-11, a complex post-traumatic stress disorder is described as a disorder that may develop following exposure to an event or series of events of an extremely threatening or horrific nature, most commonly prolonged or repetitive. So a key element here is that you can't escape, and it's prolonged and it goes on again and again and again. Now, I don't want to create a dogma here, but so that it's easier for me to understand and for other people to understand, I would generally split complex PTSD and regular PTSD like this. This is a little bit of an oversimplification, but it helps us to understand. Normal PTSD, standard PTSD, is about a singular event that can be recalled in the mind of the patient. So they have visual, auditory, olfactory, and kinesthetic memories of a traumatic event. The feelings they felt when the event occurred that they can recall. When they have a flashback to that moment, something triggers a flashback to the singular traumatic event, they recall those feelings. They recall the smell, the taste, the sound, whatever they experienced in that moment that burnt itself into the neural pathways through the trauma and horror of that moment. Complex post-traumatic stress disorder, as the name implies, is a little bit more complicated. The stimulus that creates the complex post-traumatic stress disorder is more complicated, and the body's response is more complicated. So complex in the sense that we're not talking about a singular event. You can think of this as being like the trauma delivered by a bullet versus the trauma that would be delivered by a shotgun blast, where you would end up with lots and lots of little pellets creating all sorts of trauma right the way through. So there's lots and lots of smaller things that typically the client can't fully recall. So the stimulus, the creation, was complicated, it was ongoing, it was repetitive, and it took time, and the person couldn't escape from it, so they're subjected to it over and over again. They can't recall necessarily singular traumatic events. It's not an issue of recalling singular traumatic events. So this flashback we talk about in PTSD, that's a flashback of a memory to a singular event, or singular events, plural. Don't take from this, he said singular, so he means single, he means just one. These are singular event or events, plural. Complex PTSD, not so. Much more involved in like emotional abuse, ambient abuse. The very fact that you can't escape becomes one of the elements of abuse. So the stimulus that creates the traumatic response is complicated. There are multiple factors. Then the body, the mind's response to it is complicated and complex. Instead of having visual, auditory, kinesthetic, and olfactory memories of singular traumatic events, what the body recalls is a melange, a mix of emotions that were around and endured during this period where the person couldn't escape. And it's pretty confusing. So, client number one, there's no such thing, my personal opinion now, I'll stray back into my personal opinion, there's no such thing as PTSD without complex PTSD. And there's no such thing as complex PTSD without PTSD. So let's not create false dichotomies. It's not helpful. So they always overlap. We're talking this way to help us understand. So we're drawing in crayon right now. Very non-nuanced, very simplistic. So in complex PTSD, what the client is experiencing as a quote unquote memory, as a flashback, is emotions, but without the visual and auditory and kinesthetic moments in time that cause that, they internalize the emotions as their own. So you get beaten up in a nightclub toilet. This happened to a client of mine, and they fall to the floor and they remember the smell of the bleach that was used on the floor. And then after that, and they obviously felt upset and angry and frightened and powerless. Then after that, they had a clear neural association between the smell of bleach and the traumatic event that then made them feel angry and sad and powerless, and would flash them back to the visual memory of what they saw when they were being assaulted, what they heard, and what they felt physically in the body, and not just emotionally. The client with complex post-traumatic stress disorder does not necessarily flash back to visual, auditory, and kinesthetic memories. There are elements of it where they do. Those are the PTSD elements layered on top of the complex PTSD elements. So they'll frequently just feel emotions, seeming to them to have come from nowhere. It's not that one is worse than the other. Don't create that false dichotomy. People online love to create false dichotomies. They love it. They love division. It's their favorite thing. There's no dichotomy here. One is not worse than the other. They're always there, present with each other. Client number one knows, however, I smelt bleach. The bleach reminded me of the moment I got beaten up, and this is how I felt when I got beaten up. Client number two doesn't know what the trigger was, doesn't know, have a chain of memory leading back to the emotion. They just suddenly feel overwhelming emotions of X, Y, or Z. They then internalize that as being them. So basically they think, well, I just must be crazy. I must just be damaged. I must just be broken. Then on top of everything else, they feel potentially self-loathing, guilt, shame, frustration. They can fall into a depression. They can go into sort of a self-abandonment cycle. They start regarding themselves as to use the psychoanalytic language, a bad object that's not worth rescuing, not worth saving, so on and so forth. Back to the ICD-10, back to the orthodoxy. So complex post-traumatic stress disorder, threatening or horrific nature, most commonly prolonged. E.g., torture, slavery, genocide, prolonged domestic violence, repeated childhood sexual or physical abuse. All diagnostic requirements for PTSD are met. So in the ICD-11, they're saying, you've already shown that PTSD is there. They're saying this is what you need for a diagnosis of complex PTSD. In addition, complex PTSD is characterized by severe and persistent problems in affect regulation. Number two, beliefs about oneself as diminished, defeated, or worthless. So you start to internalize the idea of yourself as bad object, just pointless, a wretched, horrible creature. The affect regulation that they mentioned, I called emotional dysregulation. So problems with affect regulation is the same as emotional dysregulation. The emotions are up and down. Secondly, self-image, terrible, really full of self-loathing and the desire to abandon the self. Three, difficulties in sustaining relationships and in feeling close to others. So massive issues around relationships and especially around intimacy, which of course is going to flip the switches for most clinicians for borderline personality disorder. So these symptoms cause significant impairment in personal, family, educational, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. So now let's quickly do the diagnostic requirements. The client needs to have shown exposure to an event or series of events of an extremely threatening or horrific nature, most commonly prolonged or repetitive events. And we've said of what nature they are. Following the traumatic event, the development of all three core elements of post-traumatic stress disorder lasting for several weeks. So the re-experiencing of the event, invasive, intrusive memories, re-experience it. The brain, the central nervous system forces us to go through the event again and again. Deliberate avoidance of reminders. So these are signs of classic PTSD. This may take the form either of active internal avoidance or external avoidance of people, conversations, activities, or situations. And then the third element that the ICD-11 requires for PTSD to be ticked off first, persistent perceptions of heightened current threat. So you become hypervigilant to threat, paranoid to threatening situations. In complex post-traumatic stress disorder, unlike in post-traumatic stress disorder, the startle reaction may in some cases be diminished rather than enhanced. Interesting. Here are some more elements of CPTSD that they require. Severe and pervasive problems in affect regulation, mood regulation, emotional regulation. So they're highly emotionally reactive to minor stresses. Violent outbursts occur. That's also going to get you pegged for incorrectly for borderline personality disorder. Reckless or self-destructive behavior, that too. Dissociative symptoms when under stress, that will too. And emotional numbing. It's classic. That's textbook criteria that clinicians would look for BPD, particularly the inability to experience pleasure or positive emotions. Next thing, persistent beliefs about oneself as diminished, defeated, or worthless, accompanied by deep and pervasive feelings of shame, guilt, or failure related to the stressor. That would also get you the BPD diagnosis. Persistent difficulties in sustaining relationships. That's going to get you a BPD diagnosis. The disturbance results in significant impairment in personal, family, occupational, other areas of functioning. You just can't live a normal adult life. You just can't function properly. Additional clinical features: suicidal ideation and behavior, substance abuse, depressive symptoms, psychotic symptoms, and somatic complaints. I'm starting to sound repetitive now, aren't I? That would also get you the BPD diagnosis. The boundary with normality, the threshold. So they're looking for a history of exposure to a stressor of extreme and prolonged or repetitive nature from which escape is difficult or impossible. That does not in itself indicate the presence of CPTSD. Many people experience such stressors without developing any disorder. Rather, careful, the presentation of the client, the way the client presents, patient presents, must meet all diagnostic requirements for the disorder. So, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, fascinating and controversial area of study. Potentially controversial because it depends on, there's different camps obviously within psychology, psychiatry, psychotherapy. There are people who believe it's all trauma. I probably largely fall into that camp. I fully accept that some things are biological. I've lived that because of, drug addiction in my life, and also I've had a traumatic brain injury. So I know that personality changes can absolutely occur due to physical changes in the body. But largely speaking, for most people, most of the time, most of the issues that we look at, most of the issues that counselors would be contacted for, that therapists would be contacted for, are based in trauma. They're based in trauma. That's a not universally accepted position. There are different groups within psychology. You could have biological hardliners, there are geneticists, there's the behavioralists. If you can't see it, weigh it, measure it, barely any relevance. There's the psychoanalysts who insist that everything is, that classic, it's actually not true, but the classic trope of the psychoanalyst, tell me about your mother, it's all got to be in your childhood or it's nothing. So there isn't a universal orthodoxy within psychology, as there isn't in any scientific endeavor. I don't personally consider psychology a science, but you could say elements of it are scientific and they're a scientific endeavor. But this is largely speaking, the consensus is what I've just given you on where CPTSD stands today. If it did become a unifying or unified theory for 90% of mental health issues, that would be of potentially massive benefit to the clients, but potentially massive damage to the money-making industry that is psychiatry and psychotherapy. We have to have adult and frank conversations about this that are non-divisive, that include psychotherapists and psychiatrists and counselors, many of whom watch this channel, many of whom contact me weekly. We don't want to create like it's us, the people, versus the elite, priesthood of the high temple of psychotherapy. That's not going to get us anywhere. That kind of thinking isn't going to get us anywhere. Largely speaking, if you're of good faith and you're interested in helping your clients, or you are a client who wants to be helped as quickly as possible, we should probably try and do our best to create spaces where we can have good faith dialogues about this without, slinging rocks at each other and saying, okay, these are different models. We don't have to all agree with each other 100% on how the models work. I mean, I'm still open. I haven't decided that it's all trauma and that's the end of it. We really don't know as far as like epigenetics goes, the way in which your genetics respond to environmental pressures. God knows, like endocrinology, the study of neurotransmitters and hormones and what they do in the body is still a fascinating study that's very much in its infancy. Neurobiology, there's so much about the brain that we don't know yet. So I keep an open mind. But generally speaking, within these conversations, you'll hear me at generally on the side of the argument of it probably mostly is trauma, which makes me do two things. It makes me very optimistic. So I'm very keen on retraining people, reskilling people, giving them new skills, giving them new strengths, reconditioning them so they can go back out in the world with better strategies, healthier beliefs, an enhanced capacity to perform and cope in an increasingly complicated world. It also means that I tend to lean out and away from medical solutions. I am not saying that for all mental health issues there is never an appropriate medical or pharmaceutical solution. There are, unfortunately, particularly now, that immediately what springs to mind is when you're talking about, it's so sad, and I feel a tiny bit guilty even saying it, but when you're looking at people who really genuinely are in the psychotic spectrum of disorders, I used to be more optimistic until I actually tried working more with people who were on the spectrum for full-blown psychosis. And really there are people who we just have to hope that the existent pharmaceutical solutions will assist them. It doesn't cure them, it doesn't heal them, it's never over, and that in the future we can get better at helping people to manage, cope, and live with these symptoms. But in the main, for most anxiety, like the thick end of the wedge of what people go to psychologists, psychotherapists and counsellors for, things like anxiety and depression and an inability to concentrate, dissociating, that kind of thing, I'm very optimistic, very, very optimistic that people can be helped. And I'm very optimistic about complex post-traumatic stress disorder, not least because I've massively reduced the symptoms in my own life. And to date, as far as I know, presuming that people are telling me the truth, I've helped thousands of people all over the world to do that also. I have a channel. It's completely free. It's called Fortress Mental Health Protection. It's on YouTube, and there's a full course there with some input from Pete Walker himself on how to reduce the symptoms of complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And as I say, it's helped, to the best of my knowledge, thousands of people from all over the world in the last 4 or 5 years. It's free. If you could like it, subscribe to it. If you could like and subscribe here and maybe share some of my material, that would be a help, and I would appreciate it. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your time and for your attention. As I say, this does not replace advice from a qualified mental health professional who specializes in the subject. If you need help, please do seek it out. Okay, folks, the new course, Unplug from the Matrix of Narcissistic Abuse, is out now. And if you're interested in finding out more about that, please click the link below.